This is the video review for HIS 121 Test 2. The first 8 questions come from Chapter 7 in your text. Number 1, what was coverture? Coverture refers to the legal status of women and the fact that women had no separate legal or economic status beyond that of their husbands. If you were a married woman, your whole legal existence was wrapped up in the existence of your husband. The second part of question 1, what were manumissions? Manumissions were voluntary decisions by individuals to grant their slaves freedom. It was not forced by the government, but instead it was individuals voluntarily freeing slaves. Number 2, who authored the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom and what did it do? The answer to that is Thomas Jefferson. He authored that statute so that Virginia would no longer have an officially endorsed religion, which prior to the American Revolution, the official religion in Virginia and other southern colonies was the Church of England, the Anglican Church. This church would end up changing its name to the Episcopal Church after the Revolution as to not be associated with England, but in the meantime, Virginia passed the Statute for Religious Freedom, which would have an impact on the U.S. Constitution. Number 3, what were the Articles of Confederation and what were their primary weaknesses? The Articles of Confederation were the documents that controlled the American government through much of the American Revolution. The Articles were actually implemented in 1777, even though the 13 colonies did not fully ratify them, and 13 states did not fully ratify them until 1781. Some of the significant weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation is that they really did not provide for a tight, cooperative governmental structure. It was just a loose confederation among the states. The branch that really controlled government under the Articles of Confederation was the legislative branch based in Congress. And the reason for that is there was no executive branch per se in the Articles of Confederation. The judicial branch also did not exist as part of the Articles of Confederation, but instead the judiciary was left to the states themselves. Another significant weakness of the Articles is for any legislation to pass, 9 of the 13 states, each state had an individual vote, and 9 of the 13 states had to approve legislation for it to pass. In addition, there was no ability of Congress and the Articles of Confederation to regulate commerce, so you had inconsistent commercial agreements amongst the states, but also with any foreign nations as well. So there were several weaknesses to the Articles of Confederation, though it did stand up and allow the country to exist until the Constitution was created. Number 4, what did the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 do? The primary function of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 was to provide the process for statehood for the Old Northwest Territory. And when I use the term Old Northwest, do not think about it in terms of modern American geography. Instead, we are talking about what we would consider today the Midwest, places as close by as Ohio and Illinois and Michigan and Indiana. Those areas were considered the Old Northwest. And the other thing that was significant about the Northwest Ordinance, besides providing the process for statehood, was the fact that the Northwest Ordinance outlawed, prohibited slavery in the Old Northwest. There was some discussion even after this ordinance had passed about changing that part of the ordinance so that slavery would be allowed, but an individual by the name of Manasseh Cutler, who was one of the early founders of Ohio and of Ohio University, he led the charge to ensure that slavery remained outlawed in Ohio. So it was never legal for slavery to exist in these Midwestern states that came in as part of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. Number 5, what was Shays' Rebellion and why was it significant? Shays' Rebellion was an outbreak of protests in the state of Massachusetts in 1787. It occurred because, 1786. It occurred because farmers who had fought in the American Revolution, many of them had, in western Massachusetts, because of poor economic conditions, many of their small farms were foreclosed. They could not pay back loans to bankers who lived in Boston area, the eastern part of the state, and it was happening to such a large percentage of farmers. They felt that they were being treated unfairly. They did not get all the wages they had been promised when they fought. Again, poor economic conditions. So they refused to allow the bankers to foreclose on the farms and sell the farms. So essentially you had a legal binding agreement between the farmers and banks, but yet the government was not strong enough under the Articles of Confederation to provide for enforcement of the legal rights that the creditors had to those farms. So it was not a very violent protest or anything like that, but what it did do is it made people very antsy, not only in Massachusetts but in other states, because it proved that the government at that point really did not have the ability to enforce the law, and that's going to lead to cause for something different than the Articles of Confederation. Question number 6. What were important features of the Virginia Plan and the New Jersey Plan? What was the Connecticut Compromise and what was the 3/5 Compromise? So to put this all in context, these are all terms that come out of the Constitutional Convention. I mentioned that Shays' Rebellion showed that the government under the Articles of Confederation was not strong enough to enforce the law. So after a further meeting in Annapolis, representatives from the different states decided that it was important that the country call for a convention to determine how to address concerns with the government, and that was the Constitutional Convention that was held in Philadelphia. One of the first things that happened at the Constitutional Convention is the Virginia delegation really established some of the structure that would be in place, and one of the things that came out of what was known as the Virginia Plan, it was called that because these were ideas that came from the Virginia delegation, who was led, the delegation being led by James Madison, was that the Articles of Confederation had to be scrapped. They couldn't just be modified, but instead there had to be something completely new. And so that was one of the features of the Virginia Plan, that the Articles of Confederation would cease to exist, and there would now be this new Constitution. There were also some other parts of the Virginia Plan that were significant. One thing that the Virginia Plan called for would be a strong national government, that the power would not rest with the states. Another thing that the Virginia Plan called for would be that there would be two houses or two chambers of the legislative branch, which ultimately was called Congress, and that the Virginians argued that these two chambers should be based on population alone, or that there should be what's called proportional representation. The more populous an area, the more representatives it had. It's not surprising that Virginia would favor representation based on population at that time, because Virginia was the most populous state in the United States in 1787. On the other hand, New Jersey sort of led the smaller, lesser populated states. Now today New Jersey is more populous than Virginia, but that was not the case in 1787. And so the smaller states wanted just one house in Congress, and they wanted that house, the makeup of that house, to be determined solely by equal representation, that each state would have the same representatives in Congress. That would be similar to the way the legislative body had existed in the Articles of Confederation, in that each state had one vote. Here there might be multiple individuals, but the number of individuals would be equal among all the states. So that was the New Jersey plan. So what happens is we have what's sometimes called the Great Compromise, or the Connecticut Compromise, because it was engineered by Roger Sherman from Connecticut. That compromise basically establishes what we have today in the United States Congress. We would have a two-house Congress, a bicameral Congress, with the lower house, the House of Representatives, being based on population. So today, the state of California, which by far has the most people of any state, they have more representatives in the House of Representatives than any other state. Some of the least populated states, like Wyoming and Vermont, only have one representative in the House of Representatives because of the number of people that they have. Meanwhile, we have a second house, the upper house, that is based solely on equal representation. Each state has 2 U.S. senators. That's the upper chamber of the Congress. It doesn't matter if you have 30 million people like you have in California, or if you have 600,000 or 700,000 people like you do in Wyoming and Vermont. Each of those states has 2 senators. So that is the Connecticut Compromise, basically taking some aspects of the Virginia plan, some aspects of the New Jersey plan, at least as it relates to the legislature, and then enacting what we now have in Congress. The last part, number 6, though, had to deal with the issue of the 3/5 compromise. That revolves around the issue of slavery. Southern states wanted to count slaves as individuals when it came to counting how many representatives you should have in the House of Representatives, which is sort of an unusual position, because it's very obvious that slaves had no political rights whatsoever. Slaves were not going to have, they were enslaved. They had no civil rights. They were not going to have the ability to vote. So why should they count as individuals when trying to determine how many representatives the people would have in the House of Representatives? Because really they would not be representing slaves. So the position from northern or non-slave states would be, don't count slaves at all. So there ended up being this compromise, and it's called the 3/5 compromise, and it's pretty offensive, but it represents the way things were in the United States at that time. The 3/5 compromise essentially says that slaves, for representation purposes, would count as 3/5 of an individual. So to use an easy example from a math standpoint, let's say there were 100,000 slaves in Virginia. From a representation standpoint, they would count 3/5 that amount, or 60,000. So that's what the 3/5 compromise was. It dealt with how to count slaves in regards to representation in the House of Representatives. Number 7, what is the Electoral College? Under the Constitution, the Electoral College is how the United States determines who the President of the United States is. It is not based merely on the number of votes, but instead based on the number of votes within states and how the states allocate their electoral votes. So each state gets the same number of electoral votes as the number of individuals they have in Congress. So you combine the number of individuals that a state has in the House of Representatives plus their 2 senators, and that gives you the number of electoral votes they would have. So the state of Wyoming, for example, only has 1 member in the House of Representatives. They have 2 senators. They would get 3 electoral votes. So the way the Electoral College works is you are awarded those votes in 48 48 states and the District of Columbia, if you win a state, we have what's known as the winner takes all provision, meaning that the individual who wins that state gets all of its electoral votes. In 2 states, the state of Maine and the state of Nebraska, it's just a little bit different. In Nebraska, the electoral college votes are allocated based on congressional districts. And so whoever wins the most votes in those states, in Nebraska and Maine, they get the 2 senatorial votes, so to speak, in the electoral college. But then the individual districts are then divvied up based on how people vote within specific districts. So, for example, in the 2020 election in Nebraska, Donald Trump won the overall election there. He got the 2 electoral votes from the Senate, and then he won every congressional district except 1. So that meant that Joe Biden actually got 1 electoral vote out of Nebraska. The opposite happened in Maine. Joe Biden won that state, but Donald Trump won 1 congressional district, so he got 1 of the electoral votes. And the other 48 states, it goes to winner takes all. And what happens sometimes, if we look at the 2000 election, George W. Bush won the Electoral College, but Al Gore actually won the popular vote. So it's not based on how many people in America vote for a specific candidate. It's based on how the Electoral College shakes out. The same thing happened in 2016. Hillary Clinton had about 2 million more votes than Donald Trump, but Donald Trump won the Electoral College fairly comfortably. So that's how we decide who wins the presidential election. It's not based on who gets the most overall votes, but instead who wins the votes in the Electoral College. Number 8, the last question for Chapter 7, distinguish between the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. This is very straightforward. You hear these 2 terms, Federalists and Anti-Federalists. All we are referring to is the position that individuals had on the ratification of the Constitution, whether the Constitution should be approved. Later on, in the next chapter, Chapter 8, we'll talk about the founding of political parties. And the term Federalist is used there as well, so that might be a little confusing. But as it relates to the Constitution itself, it's very straightforward. The Federalists were the individuals who supported ratification of the Constitution. The Anti-Federalists were those individuals who opposed ratification of the Constitution. So that's the last question from Chapter 7. So the next question starting in Chapter 8 is number 9, what is the Bill of Rights? We mentioned in question number 8 that the Anti-Federalists were those individuals opposed to the ratification of the U.S. Constitution. One thing that folks who advocated for the Constitution did to help win over some opposition is to promise that individual rights would be protected against infringement by the federal government, and those individual rights would be enumerated in 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And so that refers to the Bill of Rights. From amendments 1 through 10, these are rights that many of us are very familiar with. The First Amendment has several rights indicated in it to protect individuals from intrusion by the federal government. That include things like freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of religion. Of course, Second Amendment is the right to bear arms. We have the Fourth Amendment, protection against unreasonable searches and seizures. The Fifth Amendment, the right against self-incrimination. Sixth Amendment is the right to jury trial. Eighth Amendment, protection against cruel and unusual punishment. All those are things that we're very familiar with. Over the years, what has happened is the courts have ruled that because some of these rights are essential rights, that they are deserving of protection not only from the federal government but also from state government. So that's why we have protections for things like double jeopardy, and criminal defendants can't be compelled to testify in state courts any more so than they can in federal courts and that type of thing. So a lot of these rights initially were just protected against intrusion by by the federal government now, it also protects individuals from those rights being trampled upon by either the state or federal government. So that's the Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution, to help win over support for the ratification of the Constitution, the protection of certain individual liberties. Number 10, what were the features of Alexander Hamilton's economic plan for the new country? Alexander Hamilton had been a military aide to George Washington, and he is going to be one of the primary really catalysts or movers within the administration of George Washington when Washington became president. One of the things that Hamilton wanted to do was for the national government to take on all the debt of the states. And the reason he wanted the federal government to assume this debt was he believed that that would help unite all the states together. If it was left just to the states to take care of their own debt, that would keep some of these divisions between the states. But if everybody had an interest in the United States succeeding economically, then that would strengthen the country as a whole. So that's why he wanted every debt owed by states to be taken on by the federal government. There were some opponents to that. For example, Virginia had almost no debt, so if you were in Virginia, it didn't make a lot of sense that you would be saddled with this large national debt when, as a state, you didn't have very much debt. So to win over Virginia, what was agreed upon was that the location of this new capital that would be created for the United States, where before the capital had been in New York and in Philadelphia, that the capital would now be located close to Virginia. And so the federal government purchased some land for Virginia and Maryland, kind of a swampy area along the Potomac River, and it became the District of Columbia, which would be named after George Washington eventually. And so in return for that, Virginia agreed to Hamilton's plan that the country would assume the debt of all states. So that was one of the primary features of the economic policy of Alexander Hamilton. Number 11, what two parties developed in support of Hamilton and Jefferson, and what were their respective positions on significant issues of the 1790s? So back in question 8, we talked about Federalists and Anti-Federalists, and we said that was only related to the ratification of the Constitution. What happens, though, as we get into the 1790s, this is 4 or 5 years after the constitutional battle, we start to see the emergence of two political parties. One group is the group that follows many of Alexander Hamilton's position, and they become known, and you've heard this term before in a different context, as the Federalists. They favor the national bank. That was another feature of Alexander Hamilton's economic policy. He wanted a national bank that could issue funds to the government. It was not specifically mentioned in the Constitution, but he supports it. He believes that it was allowed because it was not prohibited by the Constitution. On the other side, though, Thomas Jefferson is opposed to this national bank concept because it was not specifically allowed by the Constitution, and so he's opposed to it. But the necessary and proper clause in the Constitution seems to support the expansive powers of government, and so eventually Hamilton wins out in that regard. But what happens is that it's not the only issue where there's disagreement. Hamilton and his supporters seem to support commercial interests. That's especially important in the northeast of the United States, whereas Jefferson and his supporters seem to support the agrarian interest. Hamilton is in favor of that strong national government. He was one of the individuals who wrote the Federalist Papers back when they were debating the ratification of the Constitution. Jefferson, however, favors states' rights. As it comes to foreign policy, Hamilton is very much pro-British, and Jefferson is very much pro-French. So all those differences and the supporters of Hamilton and Jefferson lead to the development of these two political parties. Hamilton's party becomes known as the Federalists. Again, they favor commercial interests. They favor a strong national government. They're pro-British in their policy, and they tend to be based more in the Northeast. Meanwhile, Jefferson's followers who support the same issues he has, that they're favor more states' rights. They favor agrarian interests. They're based more in the South. They are pro-French. They become known as the Republicans. Sometimes you will see in your textbook and in slides the term Democratic Republican with a hyphen between Democratic and Republican. The reason for that is the Republicans that emerged in the 1790s are not the same Republicans that we have today. In fact, they're much more closely connected to the Democratic Party today. Most Democrats would consider Jefferson as the founder of their political party. The modern Republicans are not formed until the 1850s on the issue of free soil opposition to the expansion of slavery. So this group of Republicans is different. That's why you see the term in your book, and in the slides you will see the Democratic Republican to distinguish it from the modern Republican Party. So those are the two parties that emerged, the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans. The Federalists aligned with Hamilton, the Democratic Republicans aligned with Jefferson. Number 12, who was Citizen Edmond Genet? Edmond Genet was a French diplomat who violated George Washington's neutrality proclamation. During the 1790s, the French and British go to war with each other. I've already mentioned the political parties supported different interests there. The Republicans supported the French, while the Federalists supported the British. And so what happens is there's both sides pushing for the U.S. to enter the war on one side or the other. And George Washington says, we're not going to do it. We're going to have a neutrality proclamation. And he warns anyone from trying to push America towards one country or the other. Well, Edmond Genet comes over representing France, and he's secretly trying to convince individuals like George Rogers Clark, who had been a Revolutionary War hero out in Illinois and Indiana and fighting the Indians there during the American Revolution. He tries to convince him to raise an army to go against, to fight against the British. So Washington puts a stop to that. And he could have sent Genet back to France, and Genet probably would have been executed because there was this complete chaos and turmoil in France, the Reign of Terror. If you had Western Civ, you may be familiar with that. But instead, he allows Genet to settle in the United States, and some of Genet's ancestors actually become quite prominent in America's military effort in World War I. But that's another story. But anyway, Edmond Genet was a French diplomat who tried to rally support for the French while he was in the United States. Number 13, what was the Jay Treaty? That was the treaty that John Jay, who was actually our first Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, helped negotiate with the British because tensions were high between the British and the U.S., especially on the seas and on the U.S. frontier. And this treaty basically required the British to abandon some forts on the western frontier of the United States and to pay for some other things. Meanwhile, the U.S. agreed to pay back any debt that it owed the British from the American Revolution. So this is 20-some years after the Revolution, and yet in about 12 years or so after the end of the Revolution, that outraged a lot of people. People thought it was way too pro-British. As you might imagine, the Federalists tended to support the treaty while the Democratic Republicans were opposed to it. When George Washington left office after serving 2 terms, there was no constitutional limitation on how many terms the president could serve, but George Washington made the decision that would become the custom all the way until the 20th century, where American presidents would not serve more than 2 terms. Now it's constitutionally limited after the 1940s and the 4 terms to which Franklin Roosevelt was elected. We now have constitutional prohibition that basically prevents anyone from serving more than 10 years, 2 terms and part of another term. But back then that was not the case. But George Washington set the precedent, the example, by refusing to serve more than 2 terms. In his farewell address, he issued 2 warnings. One took hold. The first warning was that America should not enter into entangling alliances with other countries. That goes in line with his neutrality proclamation to keep us from entering a war between France and Britain on one side or the other. So he warned against entangling alliances, and so America's primary foreign policy doctrine, all the way up through even counting World War I into the 1930s, would be this policy of isolationism. Again, much easier to do back in those days than now, and a lot of reasons why it's probably not a very good pursuit in foreign policy today. But that George Washington warned against entangling alliances. The other thing he warned against in his farewell address was political factions, that America should not utilize political parties. Unfortunately, at that point, the horse was out of the barn, because we had, as we mentioned previously, two political parties already emerging, the Federalists led by Hamilton and the Democratic Republicans led by Thomas Jefferson. Another feature of the economic policy of Alexander Hamilton was to raise revenue through taxes. And one of the taxes that he imposed was something called the whiskey tax, that would tax the use of and sell, production, manufacture, and sale of whiskey. Whiskey had become very prominent in the American economy because, especially on the western frontiers, settlers, especially those known as the Ulster Scots or Scots-Irish, those individuals who of Scottish ancestry, whose ancestors had gone from Scotland into what is today Northern Ireland before then moving over to the to America. They used that to barter and to trade, and so whiskey had an important role on the frontier. And to make matters worse with this whiskey tax, the way it was enforced really varied from region to region. There were some states and some geographical areas where the tax collector did not make a real strong effort to try to collect the tax, while in some areas like western Pennsylvania, they were much more strict on how they collected that tax. And so that angered a lot of individuals on the western Pennsylvania frontier. And so they protested against this tax and actually raised an army to oppose the collection of this tax. So, if you recall back in 1786, when we had the Shays Rebellion in western Massachusetts and the Articles of Confederation was in effect, it scared people because the government was not strong enough to enforce the law. We had the exact opposite happen here in 1794. George Washington, he actually rode at the head of these troops for a while. He didn't follow them all. He didn't lead them all the way to Pennsylvania. But we had 13,000 troops from various states go into western Pennsylvania to put down the rebellion. So, of course, once those who were rebelling heard about how many thousands of troops were coming, they skedaddled, as you might imagine. They scattered, and so there was no military conflict. But what the Whiskey Rebellion is important for is really it's the opposite of what happened in the Shays Rebellion. Shays Rebellion showed the American people that the government was not strong enough in 1786 under the Articles of Confederation to enforce laws. In 1794, the Whiskey Rebellion showed that under the Constitution, the government was in fact strong enough, the federal government, to enforce laws. So it kind of showed early on the strength of the new national government. Question number 15, what was the XYZ affair? I mentioned previously that there was frequent conflict during this time period between the British and French, and that conflict often created issues for America on the seas or on the frontiers. And so there were different calls at different times for the U.S. to join in this war between Britain and France. Again, the Republicans pushing for the Americans to support the French, while the Federalists were calling for the Americans to support the British. What happened in the XYZ affair is that France had been creating some issues interfering with American trade. John Adams, who became the second president of the United States after George Bush chose not to run for the time, John Adams had sent 3 diplomats to France to try to negotiate an end to these tensions, and the French foreign minister essentially demanded bribes. There were 3 agents, hence the term XYZ, who approached each of the 3 diplomats sent to France, demanding that they pay bribes before they could even meet with the French foreign minister. That wasn't uncommon in British diplomacy, but it irked Americans to no end. So with this bribery scandal, that France demanding bribes in order to even talk about this issue with the American diplomats, it angered a lot of Americans, and of course immediately the Federalists were clamoring for war against the French. However, John Adams, who was essentially a Federalist, remember political parties were new, he had some independence, but he was essentially a Federalist. John Adams refuses. He keeps America out of the war. That probably cost him the chance to win the presidential election of 1800, but it does keep America out of a war against the French. So the XYZ affair involves the bribes demanded by 3 French agents in order for American diplomats to meet with the French foreign minister. Number 16, what were the Alien Sedition Acts? What did Jefferson and Madison author in response to those laws? The Alien Sedition Acts were passed in 1798 by Federalists. The whole purpose of these laws was to strengthen Federalists and to weaken the Democratic Republicans. At that point in time, the Federalists were in charge in Congress. They had a Federalist president, John Adams, and so they passed laws that the alien part of it extended the time period that someone coming from another country had to be in America before they could vote. And you have to realize such a huge portion of Americans during this time period were immigrants from other countries. We had a new country. People from Europe were coming over constantly, and they tended to, most of these individuals coming from other countries, tended to support the Democratic Republicans. And the Federalists were aware of this, so they wanted to lengthen the time by passing this law that someone had to be in the country before they could vote in order to undermine some of the Democratic Republican strength. That was one part of it. Maybe the worst part, though, for sure, was the second half of that, the Sedition Acts. The Sedition Acts basically barred criticism. You think back to the First Amendment and free speech, and political speech today is the most protected form of free speech. But in 1798, the Sedition Act said if you were critical of the government, that you could be acting against the interests of the government, and you could be charged with sedition. And really, it was not used a lot, but it was primarily directed against newspapers. During this time period, newspapers were completely political. Even today, we know that there are networks that tend to be more supportive. Fox and One America and Newsmax are going to be very conservative networks supporting Republican causes, whereas MSNBC is going to be liberal and support Democratic causes and things like that. Well, in the late 1790s, the vast majority of papers were intended to be political papers and supporting one party or the other. And so the Sedition Acts were passed by the Federalists, and they were used basically to go after some Republican newspapers to keep them from being critical of the government. And so today it certainly would violate freedom of speech and freedom of press, but the court upheld it back then. And it was probably good that the Federalists got it in there for a couple of years, because these laws are going to backfire in 1800. The Democratic Republicans are going to win big. But the second half of question 16 is, what did Jefferson and Madison do in response to those laws? Well, they authored the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions, which basically said that states could not enforce laws that were unfair, that were unduly burdensome to the states, that clearly violated the Constitution. And so that gave states the idea of the right to nullification, which did not last long, but it stays around. And we have this crisis that we're going to see in South Carolina in the 1830s, the nullification crisis. Then by the time we get to the Civil War, those same ideas are going to be out there. But Jefferson and Madison authored the Kentucky, that was Jefferson, and Virginia, that was Madison, resolutions arguing for nullification. Number 17 was the concept of judicial review that emerged in Marbury versus Madison. Very famous concept that basically says the courts have the ability to review acts of the president and of Congress to determine their constitutionality. That was an 1803 decision. That concept of judicial review still remains in effect today. So now we're at question number 18. So question 18 asks, what were the causes of the War of 1812? And so I have these. This is on slide 26 from chapter 8. It gives you the answers. You can see one of the big things was the impressment of American sailors. Impressment essentially meant kidnapping. They would basically take sailors off of American vessels and force them to serve in the British Navy. Some of those sailors that they would take off American vessels may have in fact deserted from the British Navy, but a lot of them were born in America, never set foot in Britain, and yet all of a sudden they were kidnapped, essentially forced into the British Navy in this outrage, as you might imagine, a lot of Americans. That was not uncommon. Going back throughout the 1700s, the British had filled out their ships by actually sending what they called the press gangs out to towns, especially port towns, and if you were drunk on the docks, all of a sudden you might wake up on a ship part of the British Navy. They would even go on to merchant vessels where you had individuals who had been away from home, sometimes for months or even years, finally returning home, and they get taken off the vessels and forced into the British Navy. It was really a pretty horrific practice, but it was a common practice in Britain. It did not go over well when you start putting Americans on these ships against their will, and that outraged a lot of Americans, and that was one of the causes of the war. Even though the British, just so you know, before the war actually started, the British committed to stopping that practice. The other thing that had been going on for years was British interference with American trade. Again, we had sanctions between Britain and France against America, and it just created all sorts of issues. And so that was one of the problems that we had, and that led to this war. Three, we had this group of influential congressmen who were known as the War Hawks. They wanted to expand America, and they had their eye on Canada. What turns out, to give you a heads up, just like in the American Revolution, when we invaded Canada, we lost at Quebec. Same thing happens in the War of 1812. We do burn the capital of Ontario at York. The British gets back by burning the White House, but we one of the motivating factors for this war is perhaps we could take Canada from the U.S. And again, spoiler alert, that didn't work out. I'm sorry, from the British, not from the U.S. Number four, the British armed Indians on the west, including Shawnee and Tecumseh, the Shawnee leaders Tecumseh and Prophet. That was a continued issue on the frontier. The British were still out there. They were still giving weapons, still stirring up Indians, and that angered Americans. And then finally, Madison looked at this as an opportunity to restore confidence in America. We had been an independent nation for just about 30 years or so, and we had struggled economically. We hadn't really established ourselves militarily or anything like that. But this looked like a chance for us to really show that, hey, we could beat the British again. So these were some of the reasons this war happened. As you might suspect, the Federalists, who were typically pro-British, were opposed to it, while the Democratic Republicans, who were typically pro-French and anti-British, were in favor of America going to war against the British. So number 18, we talked about the causes of the War of 1812. Number 19 deals with some terms from that war, individuals and places and things. The first is Tecumseh. He was the Shawnee Indian chief who had helped organize the strong Shawnee Confederation with his brother known as the Prophet. Tecumseh actually ends up being killed during the War of 1812, but he is, again, an important figure in the War of 1812 and in American history as a Shawnee leader. The Treaty of Ghent. Ghent is a city in Belgium, so you might be wondering why we're talking about Treaty of Ghent. That is the treaty that ends the War of 1812. So we call it the War of 1812, but it actually goes from 1812 to 1815. And this Treaty of Ghent was negotiated, signed late in 1814, but it doesn't, word of the treaty doesn't get back to America for quite a while, for several weeks. And in the meantime, in the interim, while the treaty is on its way back to the United States with news, the diplomats with news that peace is at hand, the biggest battle of the War of 1812 is actually fought after the war is over, and that's in 1815. That's the Battle of New Orleans, where the United States wins an overwhelming victory against the British, and the Americans were led by Andrew Jackson. It was, and when I say overwhelming victory, the number of Americans who died was very limited, while it just wreaked havoc on the British. So that's the Battle of New Orleans. Again, the biggest battle, and a battle fought after the war had actually been, a peace had been negotiated. So number 20, what were the consequences of the War of 1812? That is also found in the slides at the end of chapter 8, but essentially there's more international respect for America as we've won our, at least we fought the war to a standstill. I think you could say it was maybe a draw, but maybe favored America a little bit. Sectionalism was discredited for a while. Of course, we know the Civil War is not too far down the road because people in New England, primarily the Federalists, had opposed America's involvement in the war. That pretty much is going to be the end of the Federalist Party, though, because of their opposition to the war. After the Americans win the Battle of New Orleans, there's a lot of American pride, and the Federalists kind of look like sore losers, and they're basically going to be insignificant politically until they're done. And so it's going to be until the late 1820s, early 1830s, the only party really in existence is the Republicans, until the Democratic Republicans, or Republicans, until they split up into what becomes known as the Democrats, who are the majority of the Republicans, and then we have a party called the Whigs. So anyway, that will happen in the 1830s. This also led to a resolution, essentially, of conflict between British Canada and the United States. Canada doesn't become an independent nation until 1867, but there's not a push for America at that point to try to conquer Canada after this war, and then also the American nationalism is on the rise after the end of the war. Okay, so those are the first 20 questions in this test review, and that covers, that's the majority of the questions on the test review, covering chapters 7 and 8.